Hello everyone, and welcome to Spacedock. I'm Hujuana, and today I want to dispel some myths surrounding realism in sci-fi, particularly the notion that something being more realistic makes it somehow superior to unrealistic sci-fi. But what even is realism? I think the generally accepted definition of realism in sci-fi is something along the lines of making use of real physics in a setting, real thrust gravity, real weaponry, things like that. I will get around to talking about that stuff in a minute, but first I think there's another way of presenting realism, through creating a fictional world in such a way that it feels grounded and believable. You might consider this to be verisimilitude instead of realism, which is fair enough, the two are closely related. The original Star Wars film did this exceptionally well by creating a universe that was dirty and lived in, though it was still very much a fantasy film in sci-fi clothes. 2 years after Star Wars came Alien, which did much the same thing with its space trucker aesthetic. That film had regular working people doing regular working jobs, with regular people relationships that everyone can instantly relate with, but it all just happens to be occurring out in the depths of space. Together, these two films represent one facet of what realism can mean, without in any way being realistic. They both show living worlds that you can instantly be immersed within, that you can get the characters because of the mundanity of their lives before the big events of each film happened. Both franchises did move away from this as they continued, but at the moment, Andor has really brought back this style of realism to Star Wars in a big way. You should go and watch Andor, by the way. It's extremely good, to the point where it may be the best Star Wars has ever been, while simultaneously being the least Star Wars-y Star Wars product ever made. Give it a go, but make sure you watch at least the first 3 episodes. The show does these mini-arcs of that length. Back to realism though, where one thing I've seen brought up is the idea that Star Trek is somehow hard sci-fi, which is just totally bonkers. Just because something occasionally explains stuff using technobabble, or occasionally references real-life concepts, does not mean it's hard sci-fi. Friend of the channel Rowan J. Coleman has done a much better video on this topic, so go and watch that because he absolutely covers this far better than I can. Once you've done that, come back here, like the video and subscribe to the channel, then listen to me talk about how I think The Expanse is really the core problem with some online discourse regarding realistic sci-fi. Ready? Okay, well, it's only a minority of discussion that ever goes this way, but that small bit is still pretty annoying to me, as I'm 100% a proponent of having a bit more realism in sci-fi. But when that is met by people smugly stating how The Expanse is superior because of its realistic elements, it just makes me sad, because that is going to put off people who may otherwise be receptive to it, but are far more comfortable with the softer sci-fi that pervades pop culture. It's also a very naive and arrogant position to take, because The Expanse has a hell of a lot of stuff that is very far from realistic. This is either to make the crazy elements of the proto-molecule more dramatic through contrast, or because the creators simply did not want to include them. On the first one of those, dropping a proto-molecule into other franchises would be very not interesting. Oh look, it can move around space with little effort. Oh look, it can open gateways across space. Yeah, and? What is fantastical in The Expanse is mundane in other franchises, which is sort of the point. The second one of those things is the lack of radiators and lasers and stuff, and even things like the Epstein drive, which is just arbitrarily capable in order to shorten time spans in the story. So it's got some realistic things and a lot of unrealistic elements, but on the whole it certainly leans towards the harder end of sci-fi, especially compared to the vast majority of popular science fiction. And that, I think, is where people get this weird idea that The Expanse is better because of realism. To a great many people, the show was their very first experience with harder sci-fi, and they really vibed with it, which is entirely understandable. It would have been a whole shiny new way of seeing a genre they may have thought to be tapped out and derivative, a very exciting and energizing proposition. So perhaps they go look for more stuff like it and find there's a whole side of science fiction like that, or go online and talk up the show and its fresh approach to presenting things. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with that, but when that person then goes and says other sci-fi is inferior, that it's not worth paying attention to, then they have crossed the line. It's also circling right back around to the other side of things, where people may not go and engage with some show or game or film because they don't see it as being worthy of their attention. Why cut yourself off from fantastic content you might love because of the way a setting presents itself? Why go online and smugly tell people that you're a muppet who ignores great stories and characters because they don't use thrust gravity? Just bizarre behavior. I suppose it could also be people conflating their opinion, where they prefer realistic stuff, with objective fact, but this has been a pretty negative video so far, so let's change it up, because I am definitely on the side of wanting to see more realistic elements in popular sci-fi. There's plenty of content that doesn't care in the slightest about realism, especially these last few years as we are enjoying a bit of a glut of amazing releases. There is still plenty of room for sci-fi that trends to the harder side though, but I understand this often involves a lot of extra work and attention that just might not be a priority of the creators. However, there's no need to go all in on the realism every time. The Expanse certainly didn't, and that got 6 excellent seasons coming from 9 amazing books. It still should have had radiators though, they're so damn cool looking. I mean, look at them! We had these renders in the laser weapons video a couple weeks ago, but didn't truly credit them beyond saying Theo Bouvier created the art. But the designs themselves are by L5 Resident for their project called The Lunar War. This is definitely on the harder end of sci-fi, but there's no need to go all the way to this level for every setting. But if you do just flirt with real science here and there, there's also the issue of never being realistic enough for certain parts of the audience, like me when I complain about The Expanse not having radiators. Whenever you include even a tiny bit of genuine science, there's going to be people asking, well, why didn't you add more? Which can be exhausting as a creator who has to deal with things like deadlines and budgets and just not wanting to go that in depth. If a creator is so inclined though, realism can be used simply as a way of changing up what is otherwise a fairly unrealistic setting, to give you different story options from the regular tropey stuff that pervades the genre, or to impart a specific feeling to the world you are creating. Gundam is a great example here, as it has crazy stuff going on. It has made up physics with the Minovsky particle, etc., but still includes hard SF concepts and technologies as well. I just want to see more of that sort of thing. There's plenty of soft sci-fi going around. Give me things we haven't seen, like Kasaba howitzers, which we covered in our nuclear weapons video. And that's the whole reason I wrote those videos, to give the amazing creators out there who may not have heard of this stuff some inspiration, to give new ideas to the amazing writers, artists, and others out there in the audience to set the gears in your mind turning. I may not ever see what you make, but others will, and maybe they will get inspired in turn, and perhaps I'll see some of what they create. So give realism a go. It doesn't even have to be super in-depth, and you don't even need to have anything approaching real numbers for it. But also, if you are a science fiction consumer and you do want that detail, don't demand it of creators who would prefer to get on with telling a story, with creating vibrant characters and compelling plots. To be clear, I'm not implying that hard sci-fi can't have these things, and absolutely do not assume that because some sci-fi does not care in the slightest about realism, that it is somehow not worth engaging with. Let people enjoy things, whether you do or not. If you enjoyed this semi-rant about people's attitudes towards realism in sci-fi and want to see more, you can support Spacedock by becoming a channel member, by giving us super thanks, or by joining our Patreon. Thank you all to our wonderful supporters, and thank you for watching.